right, well, hey everyone. Hopefully you've enjoyed the conference so far. I know I have. Watched a lot of good sessions here. So this is PowerApps Makeover, Basic to Beautiful. Obviously, before we get started, a little housekeeping. Make sure to check out the new revamped Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference in March, coming up here. Not too long. I know I can't wait for that. And of course, thanks to all the sponsors that are making this happen. Valo, Tygraph, all of them. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. And a little bit about myself here before I get started. My name is April Dunnam. I'm a partner technical architect at Microsoft. Before joining Microsoft, I was an MVP in business apps, so PowerApps and PowerAutomate, an active blogger, speaker, and vlogger. I have a YouTube channel that you can check out, and I have a lot of how-to videos with PowerApps, PowerAutomate, SharePoint, and Teams. You can follow me on Twitter at April Dunnam, and my blog is SharePointSiren.com. Oh, and of course, don't forget about the raffle for the Oculus Quest. Pretty cool VR system there. I would like to have one myself. That'd be pretty. So make sure to enter in for that. All right, so we got housekeeping out of the way now. The agenda that I want to talk about for y'all today is something that I call the PowerApps Design Pyramid. I'm going to show some tips and tricks and lots of demos. Right, so the PowerApps Design Pyramid. So I've built, over 100 or so different PowerApps since I've been using it, and I came up with this pyramid kind of to help explain what makes up a good application. Really, I mean, not just PowerApps specific, a good app in general. So I came up with this pyramid. And so the foundation of the pyramid, when you think of design, you might think about, well, that's just like the look and feel of it, and that's what the design is. But really, the foundation of a good application is performance. So you want to make sure that you have a nice performant app before you add on any of the bells and the whistles. The next piece of the puzzle is the user experience. This is what you probably typically think of when you're thinking of app design, is how does the app function, and is it intuitive for the user? So that's the next big important piece of building a great Power App. And finally, we have branding. So that is that icing on the cake. So if you have an app that's performant, it works smoothly, doesn't have a lot of load time, the user experience is really intuitive, then you want to go in, add in some nice graphics, make sure that it matches your company logo and branding and all of that. So it's really easy to remember. If you remember the acronym PUB, you'll remember the PowerApps Pyramid and the framework for a well-designed application. So I'm just going to go through each of these different buckets, and we'll talk about specific tips for each of these. So we'll start with performance, because performance is really important. You don't want your user to be like this we see here, crying, wondering why your app won't load. We want to avoid that at all costs. So before we go into the tips for performance, we need to talk about what's going on behind the scenes in PowerApps when your app initially loads. So there's this whole loading process that's going on behind the scenes before the first screen's even rendered in your application. The first thing that is happening is authentication. So we know that PowerApps is part of Office 365. And it runs within the 365 framework, so it needs to authenticate with your 365 credentials and validate that you're a valid user to access the application. Next is metadata retrieval. So once it authenticates you, it needs to go in and check what data sources you're using within your application, and also get the latest version, because behind the scenes, PowerApps has built-in version control. So each time that you make a change and save it, and publish it with your applications, there's a version in there. So it needs to go out and get the latest published version and serve that up to the user. And then next is running the on-start code. So this is code that you can add to your PowerApps that runs when the app is initially loaded. Now, this is vitally important because since all of this stuff has to happen before your app is even rendered to your user, a lot of people will put a bunch of code in that on start and cause it to really bloat, and you can have, I've seen delay times of up to 5 minutes to load an application because they have so much going on in that on start. So that's a great optimization point there that we'll look at. And finally is the rendering of the screens. So by default, what this is going to try to do is just render the very first main screen of your Power App, which I'll explain here in a little bit, but there's things that people do accidentally to make it to where it has to render multiple screens, which we want to avoid. So we'll talk about that here in a second. All right, now on to the good stuff, the tips here for performance. First tip is to utilize caching. So this really goes with any development, right? You want to offload the data, the getting of the data and working with the data as much as possible. So caching can really help with that. And I'll show you a way here in the demo in a little bit how you can utilize the caching and when you might want to use it. The next is loading data in parallel. When you are loading data in PowerApps, it's important to remember that by default is going to load the data sequentially. So if you need to get data from, say, 5 different SharePoint lists, and you have your functions in your Power App to go through and get each of those are going to have to run. The first one's going to have to run and get data from list A, then it has to wait till that finishes, which could take a while if, say, there's multiple thousands of records in that list. And then it has to do it from list B and so on and so forth. So that can be very time consuming. So there's a trick that you can do in PowerApps to load that in parallel to save you some time. The next is to eliminate screen dependencies. So I just said a moment ago that when the app loads, it tries to only load that very first screen. But if you have dependencies on other screens, then it's forced to load those screens upon initial load of your application as well. So we'll show how you might accidentally get yourself into that scenario and how to avoid it. And finally, we want to avoid repeating the same formulas. I see this one a lot, and it just creates unnecessarily lag and load in your applications if you're repeating the formulas. So with that, I want to go straight into some demos on performance. All right. So the first app that I'm going to be looking at here is this company store application. So I'm just going to play it for you first before we get it up in edit mode, just to see it's a very simple application, really. It's just a place where we can go and order some supplies for a company here. So we have this broken down into different categories, so I can choose if I'm shopping for shirts, hats, or stickers. And select one of those categories. It's going to show me a list of products within those categories that I can look at and click on one of those products and add that to my cart and place the order. So like I said, pretty simple and straightforward application. And you can notice that it was pretty fast too, right? A fairly performant application. So let's see what's happening in the background of this. So I go here to the landing screen. See, the first thing that we have is a gallery on the screen. And this gallery is a list pointing to products. So the back end of this is just SharePoint. So I have a couple SharePoint lists here. One for products where all the products are stored. And then I have another one for categories and orders and sizes. Right, so fairly straightforward data architecture. But what I'm doing here is you'll notice that the data source, if we click on that, is actually a collection. So rather than pointing this data source directly to my SharePoint list, I'm utilizing a collection. Now, why am I doing that? Is because I'm utilizing caching, which was my first big performance tip. And I'm caching this data because this is the perfect use case for that. These categories in the store are really never going to change throughout the use of this session of the app. Categories are very rarely added, so this data doesn't need to be pulled each time I hit the screen. Because if I just bound that directly to my SharePoint list, every time I load up this screen, it has to go call and get all of the data, all of the columns in the data. And if I have a bunch of categories, that could be a little bit costly from a performance standpoint. So this is a great use case for me to cache that and only call it once when the app is initially loaded. So to do that caching, we can put in a formula in our app on start. So we can just click here on the app tab, go to this on start dropdown, And in here, we can put in some formulas. Now, you'll see I have several in here, but the one that I'm doing the categories for is this one. Notice we have a clear collect. So that's a way for you to create a new collection, which is just a temp table, basically in PowerApps of data that you can store and use. So you create the collection, you give it a name, which I'm giving this the name of product categories. And then I'm also doing some sorting. So that's another benefit of collections. You can do some pre-sorting or pre-filtering on your collections that you're storing within your app. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm doing a sort by column so that I can get these in alphabetical order. So I'm pointing it to my categories SharePoint list and sorting them by the ascending title. So now this data will be loaded into this collection that I can use one time when the app is loaded, and I don't have to worry about consecutive calls. You'll see that I'm also doing this for the product listings because new products aren't added too frequently either. So that's another use case for me to be able to cache this data. So I'm going in here, and in this case, I'm caching it to make it more performant because if, for example, here in the categories, the way that I did it now, it's going to take all of the fields in my SharePoint list and put those into a collection. Now, if you have hundreds of fields, that might not be the most performant thing. So another thing that you can do when you're using these collections is to break them out and only get the fields that you're wanting to use. So that's what I did here in my products list because I have several fields in that list and I really only care about the name, the vendor, the ID category, and the image. So I've just went through and mapped those with names to the corresponding name in my data source so that I can use those and only pull those specific fields. So once I have that in a collection, all you have to do is go into your gallery and point that to your collection as a data source instead of a list. Okay. Right, so the next tip was about screen dependencies. And this is a big one that I'll see. Now, when I talk about screen dependencies, what I mean is, in this particular app, I have a list of categories at first. And then I want that to go to another screen, which in my case is this category browse screen. And I want that to be filtered based off of what I selected in that first category gallery there. So this has another second gallery. And what you'll see oftentimes that you might do is in this gallery that you want to be filtered for this products. If we look at the items, you might do a filter where, let's just kind of erase this and we'll just start from fresh. So if I wanted to filter this, you might go in and do a filter products. And you'll say where category. So here's our category field. Let me shrink this down some. Equals. And then we'll look at, okay, so where are we getting that category from? Oh, we're getting it from gallery categories. So you'll think, okay, I'm going to go gallery categories dot selected dot title, right? So I'm just filtering my gallery based off of this. And this category field is a dropdown, so I need to do a dot value on that. All right, so the error went away now. It looks like that formula works just fine. And it did, so my data is there. So let's just test it out, make sure it works fine. So I click on stickers. It only shows stickers. If I go back and click on shirts, it's changing and showing a shirt. So that works just fine. But the problem with what I just did, the way that I did it, is I created a screen dependency. So now when my app is loading, it not only has to load this app or this screen, because this is my landing screen, because whatever screen that you have here on the left at the very top is your landing screen, and that's the screen that it wants to load by default. But because I bound this gallery to whatever was selected in the first screen's gallery, now it has to load this category browse screen as well, right? So now we're up to 2 screens, and each of these screens, they have quite a bit on them, and they're pointing to different data, so that could cause a significant load time in my app. And you can see how this could quickly spiral down and nest. So I have a product details screen, for example, and in here I have information about the product, like the picture. Well, you can see how I could point this image to my products gallery.selected.image. Now I have another dependency on the products screen, which it has a dependency on the landing screen. So now 3 screens need to be loaded when my app is trying to execute and load for the first time. So this is definitely something that you want to avoid and that I see causing significant performance delays. So how do we get around that? Well, we can pre-filter the data instead of binding it to the gallery itself. So in this case, what I can do is on my gallery on the initial landing screen where I select the category, I can go to the onSelect property. And I can just create a new collection to use in my app that's pre-filtered. So you see that I'm doing a clear collect here called filter products. And I'm filtering my SharePoint list of products based off where the category.value equals the selected item from the list, from the gallery. So now I'm doing that filtering on click, and I don't have to have that dependency. So once I have this filtered products list, now all I have to do is go to my products category browse here, and I can change this whole items, all the stuff that we just typed, and just directly bind that to my filtered products. And it will work exactly the same, but now we don't have that nasty screen dependency, and it'll work much more performantly. So if I go back and test this, click on shirts, looks right, stickers, looks great, right? So big performance saver right there. All right. Any questions so far? I don't think so. Okay, load data in parallel. That was another big one. So if you notice when we were looking at this app on start, when I used collections to get my categories and my products, you might have noticed that this was wrapped in some other kind of function called concurrent. So this is the function in PowerApps that enables you to get data in parallel rather than sequentially. You can wrap your formulas within this and it will run parallel. So if I had that like this up here, I'm using a set variable to pull in the current user's full name. That's outside of the concurrence. So right now that would have to run, and now this next formula has to run, and so on and so forth. So by wrapping that in this concurrent, I'm forcing it to run at the same time. Now, obviously, since this is running at the same time, you don't want to put things in here that are dependent on the other. So if I had, for example, up here, I'm setting a variable of the current user's name. If I then wanted to take that and filter a data source based off, to get my tasks that are due, I couldn't have those both in the concurrent because it would mess up with each other, and because they're running at the same time. So just be mindful of what you're putting in there to avoid any potential issues like that. Another thing when you're using that concurrent, your formulas are then separated with a comma instead of a semicolon. So just be aware of that. Otherwise, you'll have a big nasty error like that if you forget and separate it out with a semicolon like you're used to. All right, so those were the big performance tips. I'm going to move on now to the next piece of what I wanted to show, which was the UX tips. And I love this when we're talking about user experience. I just love this quote. Some people think design means how it looks, but of course, if you dig deeper, it's really how it works. And that's really true. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about user experience here. It's not just how it looks, and it's really how it works and how useful it is to the people using it. I also love this quote. If you find an element of your interface that requires instructions, you need to redesign it. I firmly believe in that. So when I talk about user experience, what I mean is making your app easy to use. Again, back to that first quote there. If you have to teach them how to use it, probably need to redesign it. It's too complicated. But also about making it accessible. Accessibility is huge. There was a session earlier today that I caught about building accessible PowerApps that was really good. There's lots of things that you can do. So I'm not going to go over a ton of the accessibility stuff today since there was already a session on that. So hopefully you got to check that one out. And making them efficient, effective, and engaging. Right? So how can we do all of that in our PowerApps? Well, I have 4 main tips that I want to share with you. First is don't leave your users guessing. That's the worst thing that you can do from a UX standpoint is, you're having your user click on something and, maybe it just takes a little bit to run and they don't know, did that submit successfully? I mean, what's happening? I'm trying to pull a list of customers, but it's just taking forever. Like, is it even working? So the easiest thing that you can do to make your users have that warm and fuzzy and ensure them that your app's actually working is to use success and loading messages in your PowerApps. So let's take a look at that one real quick before I move on to the other tips. So for the loading message, you might have noticed for the store app that we've been in, when I clicked on it to initially run it, so that's the default SharePoint or PowerApps loader, but you see we have this as well. You notice that cube that spun there really quickly? Well, that was a preloader that I was using. So since we had that on-start stuff, it takes just a few seconds. So rather than just leaving the user there with a blank screen for a little bit, I injected a GIF that showed a loading message to my user so that they knew that the app was working. That's something that's really simple to do. So if we go back to the store app here and look at this landing screen, you see that I just have an image control. And you can download any GIF, GIF, I don't know how you pronounce it or where you slide on that war there, but download any one of those. And you can just go to View Media and upload that into your Power App. So you see I have that in here, this blocks.svg, for example. And then you just put that in an image control. So you can go to Insert, Media, and Image, and point that to your GIF or SVG, whichever it might be. And now the only thing we need to do is we want this to show when the data processing is happening, and then we want it to hide once it's over. So that's just done with a very simple formula. So since this stuff is happening in the on-start of my app, we expand this out here. You'll notice that I was first getting the correct user's name, but then I have something here, set show loading to true. So I'm just using a global variable and setting it to true, and I'm going to set the visibility of that loading image to this. So before I run any of my crazy complex logic here in the on-start, I'm going to use this loading formula to show that. And then after I run it, so I'm getting like a theme, I was getting the categories, the product listings, all that. At the very end of all this, I'm just going to set that same variable back to false. And then the last piece of the puzzle is to go into that image that has your GIF, go into the visibility, the visible property, and set it to that variable so that your app is initially loaded, shows that, your code runs, it hides it. Simple as that. And the next tip is really simple, success screens. So as I go through this process, I'm just going to run the on-start of this app. We're going to select something, we've got to go through an order process here. And I'm going to check out. So this is another great use case. We want to make sure that the user knows that their order was submitted successfully. So we just fill in the required information. Can't spell today. You get the point. Okay. And now I'm going to click complete order. And just something as simple as this, showing a screen letting them know their order was successfully submitted. And notice what happened there though, just took it a little bit further. I showed them the success screen, but then I routed them back to the home page of the application so that they can make another order or check the status of their order, whatever it might be. It's just a nice little addition to that success message. And with these success messages, they make it really easy to do because if you notice on the new screen tab here, there's a screen template for that. And that's all I did to implement that. I just inserted that success screen template. And it gives you a nice little check mark and circle and a label where you can customize and put in some text. So that's really all that I did there. Of course, you can make this as custom or as you want. But the only additional thing I did is I put in a timer. So if we go to Insert, input, you'll see an option for timer there. So this is a great way to do if you've ever tried to looked at any of the PowerApps games that people have created. So I know someone did Pac-Man, and I think Brian Dang did Space Invaders. There's a bunch of different examples out there. Most of those apps are using timers because it allows you to let something run in the background, the timer, and then you can set like the position of something on it or do something when that timer ends, like in my case, move to another screen. So I've just set a duration of 5 seconds into this timer. And if we click on the timer in the drop down in the properties pane, you'll see there's an on timer end property. So this is where you can put in a formula to say what to do once that timer is finished, once the 5 seconds are up. So all I did there was say, we'll navigate back to my landing screen. Now, if you wanted to close out of the application, you could, instead of navigating, you could just say exit, and that would close out of the application instead. So lots of ways to customize this. And I have it showing here just so you could see what was happening, but of course, you can just set the visibility of this to off so that that's happening in the background and your end user doesn't know. They don't need to see that countdown. Sometimes it's nice though to have like a message in here, like redirecting in. So if you look at the text here, you can append your own. So you can type in something like that, ... And then so then maybe they know that, oh, okay, it's going to redirect me to a different screen and have a nice little countdown. So different ways that you can go about it. But something as simple as these loading messages and success screens goes a long way in the UX of your application. All right. The next tip, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I've seen so many apps just get bogged down and have, unfortunately, bad UX because it's just so wordy. There's such a thing as cognitive overload, and if people see too much information on the screen, too many words, they shut down and they don't want to use your application. And we don't want that. We want our apps to be nice and inviting. So a way to do that is with incorporating pictures over text when possible. So I'm going to go into a different app for this. So let's look at this application here. Just let me get it pulled up a second. Here we go. I think this employee onboarding app does a pretty good job of the visuals over text piece of this. There we go. So first of all, I love the visuals that they're using in this one. For example, for profile completeness. So you got this nice little progress bar. So instead of just having, text that says you're 70% complete with your to-do list, this, as you mark stuff complete, is going to automatically adjust and fill in this nice little bar here for us instead of the text. So something as simple as that. And so if we go over here to team as well, just incorporating pictures of the team and just nice icons where possible is really a good way to incorporate some visuals into your application. So if we just put this in edit mode real quick. And then another way too, I know there's a lot of templates out there already for requesting time off, but I created one, just another example of one to incorporate some visuals. Let's see, let me just find it real quick. That's the problem with doing PowerApps is you get so many apps they're hard to find. So if we look at this time away app, it's another example of using visuals instead of just static text, because we have a nice landing screen where we can see the buckets of the type of time off we might have, like sick leave, jury duty, vacation. And so rather than just having that text, we have this nice little donut chart where we can fill in and see, how many remaining days that we have of vacation. So this is something that you can do actually utilizing SVGs. So there's lots of great videos. I think Laura Brown, has a nice YouTube tutorial about doing these SVG visuals. but not fairly too complex to incorporate here. So I'm going to open that up as well in the background so we could take a look at that. Hopefully it'll load pretty soon. Oh, come on. It's trying. I think I'm trying to load too many things at once. All right, so first of all, let's look at back on this employee onboarding list real quick, and we'll look at that profile progress bar, because that was a nice little visual that they incorporated. So all this visual really is they're leveraging a rectangle control. So two different rectangle controls in the fill. So if we look at this one, this is our overall progress. And then we have a separate rectangle that's green, so that will fill in the bar as we make progress on it. So what's happening is the width is just getting dynamically changed based off of how many of the tasks that we've completed. So it's going to take the to-do task collection. It's going to look for the ones that are completed and divide those by the ones remaining to set the width of this. So pretty clever visual that you can have for progress in here. And this template is out there. This is just one of these several PowerApps templates that you can look at. Hopefully everyone watching knows about those, but if you go to the make.powerapps portal, you should see this option for all templates. And these are a great way to learn PowerApps. And so some of these tips that I'm showing, like the visuals, are readily available in these templates for you to start looking at and dissecting, because that's kind of how, you know, I learned when I was starting out, is taking one of these templates and seeing how they did certain things. So this is just one of those templates that they have out there that you can utilize and dissect and implement in yours and figure out how they do certain things. So that's a pretty simple one. And then a little bit on the more complex side is the SVG example. So in here I have a gallery. And for these donuts, I'm just imported an image control. But if you look at the image property, I'm not pointing to an actual image. I have a bunch of code in there. So this is that SVG code. So an SVG is just a special type of image, but you can get the code of that image and manipulate it with different things like dash arrays and stroke fills and all of that to dynamically fill in the SVG, which is what I'm doing here. And PowerApps can utilize those. So you can just put in this format here, this data tag image SVG HTML, do an and then use the encode URL formula, and then pass it in your SVG code. So that's what I did here. And you see that I'm dynamically pulling in some data from my application. So in this stroke dash array, that's where I'm telling it how to fill in my donut with the different colors. So I'm just getting the requested time off, dividing it by the time off that's allotted to dynamically fill in those values. Again, we only have so much time today, but there's great videos out there going into more details about SVGs and how to incorporate those into your PowerApps. All right. The next tip, be mindful of accessibility. So when UX doesn't consider all users, shouldn't it be known as some user experience or sucks? I think that's a really funny quote by Billy Gregory there. Accessibility should always be top of mind when you're building applications. And when I find oftentimes when we think about accessibility, you know, we think of, you know, vision and hearing, but a common accessibility issue that we come across is color blindness. So for example of how you might get around that in your applications is here. So when we're trying to denote if a particular field's required, you might do something like what we see here and highlight the text box in a red border. That unfortunately isn't really accessible because someone with color blindness wouldn't be able to see that and know that that's a required field. So that's why you want to always make sure that you're not relying on colors to visualize or display certain important information. So that's why we have like the typical asterisks that you'd see instead. So I know this is required. But also if maybe something's not required, but you want to enforce a certain type of input, like valid email, you want to make sure that maybe you can use icons instead. So like an X if it's not filled out, and then change to a check mark if it's filled out correctly. So little things like that go a long way to have nice accessible applications. And one of the great things about PowerApps in terms of accessibility is if you go to the app checker, which is this horseshoe icon here, you'll notice that there's a whole section for accessibility. So I purposely not did much to this application so you can see all the accessibility errors that it will highlight for you. So things like tab stops, so that's really important for people with vision issues to be able to have those tab stops in the applications. So that's a common thing that we'll miss. So if we click on one of these elements, for example, like this vendor name text box, one of the properties that you can configure is the tab index. So you want to make sure in your applications that you're setting those tab indexes accordingly. Another big thing is accessible labels. So for every object that you have in your Power App, you want to make sure that you have a nice accessible label for it. All right, so those are the two main things that you'll see in terms of accessibilities and how you can leverage the accessibility checker in Power Apps for that. All right, and then the last one, which to me is probably either the most important one, is to Marie Kondo your apps, because clutter is the enemy of good design. Again, that cognitive overload thing that I talked about earlier, this kind of goes hand in hand with that. You don't want to show your users too much. You want it to be nice and intuitive and clean. And I'm a big fan of the minimalist approach. So if we take a look here, so any of the templates that you look at are going to be great examples of a nice minimalistic clutter-free design. One that you might want to check out is that crisis communication template that Microsoft put out. This is a great template to use as a framework of, one, how to create a nice clean design, but two, how to create a responsive design. I'm just going to open it in the display mode here instead of edit mode. They're actually created a nice responsive application. So if you do want to make your Power Apps responsive, this is a great app to use and look at to figure out how the responsiveness works. But I love how they've really made this clutter-free and very intuitive and user-friendly. So it's very clean. We notice they're using those visuals. So I said, pictures worth 1,000 words. Their use of icons, custom icons here is great. You can click, for example, on helpful tips. We have a nice clean design here with a nice menu where I can see of all my options here, which one I'm on. I can see a nice quick card of information, read more, not too much information on one screen. Very clean, minimalistic, clutter-free application that you can use kind of as a guide when you're designing your apps. But I might come back to that if I have a little bit more time, but I know we're getting a little bit close here and I still have one big topic to cover. All right, so branding. Design isn't finished until somebody's using it. So branding is the icing on the cake, right? So you talked about we have a nice performant app. There's not long load times and all of that. The user experience looks good. Now, how can we make it nice and branded? And what I mean by branding is the color scheme. Make sure that it matches your company standard. Images, make sure you have nice, clean images. In that, if you're incorporating your company logo, make sure it's using your brand compliant logo, and clean typography that matches your company branding. So my big tips for this that I'm going to cover is to utilize your brand standard, create a branding screen, create a theme from that branding screen, and optimize your images. So if I go back here, let me just close out of a few things since my computer's wanting to be just a tad slow. Just bear with me a second. So back in the store app here, I'm utilizing this branding aspect. Now I know it doesn't look very nice because I've changed the colors to be really weird, so you can see how easy it is to change though. So everyone should have some kind of, for their company, a brand standard document. Typically this is a PDF that whoever marketing or whoever did your brand gives you, and it has particular color codes and typography that are your official company colors. So what I like to do when I'm building a Power App is to take that and make a branding screen in my application that's hidden. So any screen that you create in your Power App can be hidden as long as you don't give your end users a way to get to it. So what I did here is I created a new screen, and I've just put in rectangle controls for each of my colors that are in my brand standard. So in my case, I have 6 different primary and secondary colors for my brand standard. I went in and put in a rectangle, and I've filled those with the colors that map to my brand standard. And I did the same thing for typography. So I have, like a header font and a regular text font that match my company typography. And then of course I incorporated our official logo in case I want to use that anywhere in my app. And I went ahead and did some styling on buttons so I could see how I want our buttons to look like. Now, the beauty of doing it this way is I have my brand standard here. I can see it. I know what my colors are visually. And then I can take this a step further and add this into a collection that I can use and call in all my objects. So if I go to the app on start, you'll see that I was setting a global theme. So I'm just using a global variable and I'm mapping my company colors to the fill of those text boxes in my branding screen. Now, this is just one way to incorporate a custom theme. I know a lot of people, there's someone on the Houston call, Matt just showed something, a different way that he does branding. I know Sancho has a way that he handles branding as well. So there's multiple ways to do this. This is just a method that I like to use for this branding. But I just have those boxes on there and I map them in this variable to these colors, right? So I have a dark blue, dark red, light gray, and black. So now that I have that, what I can do is each of my objects on my screen, I can go to the fill property of this rectangle, for example. And instead of like manually typing in, this is blue or this is this hex code, I can point that to my branding variable that I created called TF theme. And if I do a dot on that, now I'll see a list of all the colors in my branding. So I can change this easily to dark red. And I can just go through and make everything match in here. So all of my headers, if I want them to be dark red, I can go through and fill it out. Now, obviously, initially, I'm going to have to set this. There's really no way to avoid that, but the real benefit of this comes in when we're talking about if you ever need to make updates to these colors for any reason. It's going to save you a lot of time doing it this way. So I think I went through and made all those headers red now. Now, if for any reason I ever need to change this, I only have to go to one spot to do that. So if I need to change this dark red color for some reason, I can just click on the box on this screen, change that shade. So see it's a lightly more muted red. Just make sure the on start's running again to get that variable. And now everywhere that I've used that is updated for me. So it's a great way to make sure that your branding is consistent and easy to maintain and update in your PowerApps by using a branding screen like this. I know I went through that a little bit fast. I do have a YouTube video on this that shows exactly how to implement this. So you can check that out on my channel if you want to go back and watch that later on. The next thing is optimizing images. So that's huge. Images, first of all, are a great way to make your PowerApps look better. But the problem is when we're adding images, you might have noticed that there's a limit. So first of all, the files themselves can't be larger than 64 megabytes when you're using those. And then you have a total of 200 megabytes cap on the amount of images that you can have. So if you're going to be using a lot of images, like, because I know I personally like to use images for icons rather than using some of the built-in ones, because just there's a limited amount that you have there. You want to make sure that you're optimizing those. So there's several websites out there for free that you can optimize those. The one that I like, though, is this image compressor. So you can just upload a file here, and it will automatically compress that image for you really easily, and compress it down as much as it can go, and you'll can ensure that it's optimized. So I can just select this image, for example. It'll compress it for me. It'll show me how much. So it was able to reduce it 68%. So from 747 kilobytes to 152. So that's a big savings. So now, and it's still a nice and clear image and good for me to use my app. So this is going to allow you to not only have more assets, more image assets in your app, but it's going to make your app run faster, because if your image will be optimized and you won't have these huge bulky images and that dreaded kind of pixelated effect, like with an image coming down the screen trying to load on you. So that's the big tip there. All right, so we did that. So here's some resources that I wanted to make sure to point you to. There's a great blog on performance optimization from Microsoft. So a lot of the stuff that I covered today is in there from the performance perspective, plus a lot more. Definitely encourage you to check that out. I'm doing a talk later tonight at 9 Central on components and PowerApps. So that really comes into play as far as creating a nice UX and making it consistent and being able to reutilize pieces of your applications easily. So you might want to check that out. And there's also a great resource there for examples of components. We talked a little bit about SVGs and GIFs and using those for like loading visuals. There's a website you can go to get some free SVGs and GIFs called loading.io. For the image compressor, another one that you can use is compressor.io to make sure your images are optimized. I like the site UI Movement because it has a lot of good just design inspiration, not just PowerApps design, but design in general for creating nice applications. And then of course my YouTube blog, and follow the Power Addicts, specifically Alan Chai and some Geetha, all of them. They have some great branding tips for your Power Apps so you definitely want to check out their blogs and YouTubes and all of that. Consider donating if you can, obviously, for United Way or whatever organization you're passionate about. Those are the links for the speaker feedback and the event feedback. Looks like I ended with about 5 minutes, so I don't know if we have any questions out there or not. Take that as a no. Didn't think I saw anything. But yeah, thanks for having me, and I hope to see you in the components session later on.